If you are feeling stuck or disappointed with where you are personally or professionally, and you want to level up your life, then I have a book for you. It's called Cracking the Rich Code and is a #1 Amazon International bestseller. I, along with a group of diverse experts from around the world, have teamed up to provide you with powerful strategies and insights that will help you achieve greater success. This book offers some valuable entrepreneurial insights that will strengthen your life, your business, and your effectiveness overall. Use the code podcast and get a 20% discount when you order from my website, www.communication247.com, or click on the link in the show notes. Welcome to the Communication 24/7 Podcast, where we communicate about how we communicate. I'm your host, Jennifer Furlong. We're going to have an awesome conversation today. I am so excited about this. I have a crisis communication expert in the house. So many questions, so many things to talk about. Dave, let me do the introduction first, and then I just want to dive right into the 1,000,001 questions that I have. Dave possesses more than 25 years of strategic public relations experience, dealing with a wide array of adverse public events. He started as a public affairs officer in the Navy and later as a corporate chief marketing officer and nonprofit president. He excels in expertly addressing a myriad of crises that span military, government, corporate, charity, and startup environments. That's really important because I want to emphasize it doesn't matter what industry you're in. You need to be prepared for when it hits the fan.
I think absolutely. Absolutely. You bring up a good point, Jen, if I could interject too. It doesn't even matter what
absolutely. Yeah.
It doesn't even matter what size of the industry anymore. Mm-hmm. And, it used to be only the big players could find themselves in there. But thanks to these wonderful little devices that we all carry around, any organization of any size in any industry can be taken down with an Instagram post. That's just the reality.
Oh, wow. And I'm sure we'll have a great conversation about Twitter as well. Yeah. That's just a completely different universe right there. So I do want to highlight some of your background as far as the crisis communication experience and employee, executive misconduct, cybersecurity attacks, product recalls, mass layoffs, large-scale accidents, criminal investigations, civil litigation matters. So again, whatever industry, and like Dave just said, whatever the size of your organization, internal things happen as well as external things. And that's really why I wanted to get a crisis communication expert on the show, because while I focus on internal communication stuff and, let's get everybody to get along and team building and let's communicate and handle all of, everything that if we're unhappy about something, let's figure out a way to dive in and address that issue. But sometimes those things just aren't enough. So Dave, before I ask you my first official question, would you mind just sharing, how did you get specifically into crisis communication? Because I love that you started as a public affairs officer. I was also in public affairs in the Marine Corps. And so there's so many different trajectories one can go when you're within public affairs. So what made you decide to go down this road?
Well, thanks for serving. Whether I don't know in exactly what capacity other than public affairs, but if you were employed by the United States military, you served, and I appreciate that from all levels. And to your point, I'm really excited to be here because one of the things that I impart on the organizations that I'm privileged to serve is the idea of focusing on your internal communications first. But we can get to that later. To your specific point, as you know, as a Navy public affairs officer, you deal with crises all the time. And I had the opportunity to be in forward deployed missions for a good percentage of my career, and particularly almost all of my public affairs time. I was in Haiti for 6 months as a spokesperson for a joint military operation. And then I was on an aircraft carrier for 2 years with a terrific staff of 7 journalists that ran 4 channels of television, an FM radio station, a daily newspaper, and we had the website. And we also did all of the community international media relations. But because of the nature of the carrier, and not only that, but the 8 other ships that went with us on deployment, crises are just part of the deal in that type of environment. We had accidents, we had mishaps. I had, unfortunately, sailors and Marines assigned to my carrier that didn't follow proper conduct, and we would have to address those in very sticky situations, oftentimes in foreign ports of call. And
imagine
and
that.
Well, yeah, right. But
Right.
in all levels, from the young kids to the early 30s, when you're out, when you're out and about doing some really tough work, you get into ports of call, sometimes the brain just stops. And unfortunately, it was a reflection on the other sailors when those would happen, or at least that was the concern that we'd have. So we would work through that. But crisis was just part of the job. And so I got to learn very quickly on how to handle those on moment's notice, and how to be able to respond and allow the ship and its crew and all of the other people around there to get back to normal operations. So when I went into the private sector about 20 years ago, I was known as the guy, whether I was in a agency environment or whether I was in-house as the chief marketing officer, I was known as the guy that could help message when there were things like layoffs and product recalls and accusations of malfeasance, whether that was with a client, an organization, or somebody affiliated with whatever the entity was. And I would quickly get to a situation where we could put the messaging in place, address it with all of the pertinent audiences, who was going to be the spokespeople, train those accordingly, and move forward. Well, as I mentioned when I interrupted you in your very kind introduction, which I appreciate, these little devices have made every organization a potential target. Their brand could be seriously called into question by somebody who's acting pretty anonymously. And so getting to now where I focus only on crisis communication support for a wide range of entities became because of the way in which we communicate now, where it is not done necessarily through, the local 6 o'clock news and the newspaper. It's done through these podcasts. It's done through social media apps. It's done through online reviews and blog sites. And that means a lot of more organizations find themselves getting their reputation called into question and having to respond for that. And I'm privileged to serve the ones that I do literally all over the country.
How prepared are you able to be? Because this pandemic, for example, this pandemic hit, and every single one of us thought, okay, a couple of weeks,
right,
like maybe a more than difficult flu season, and then we're just going to get back to things. And 2 years later, we're still arguing and worrying. Of course, everything's been politicized. And so that adds another layer, of difficulty to it. So what do you say to leadership regarding lessons learned from the pandemic? Because I know there are a lot of organizations now that are looking to see, okay, what did we do well? And what did we do that, that probably wasn't a really smart thing?
Yeah, a lot there. So let's unpack it. The first question that I heard was, can you prepare for a crisis event? And I say, absolutely, you can. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can predict something like a pandemic or some issue there. But at its core, every organization carries with it inherent risks, if only because they interact with people on some level, whether it's virtually or in person, whether you're a mom and pop outlet or you're a big entity or e-commerce shop, whatever the case may be. You engage people for the ability to affect, commerce, whether that's because you sell a product or service, or you're a nonprofit that offers, support to a certain population or what have you. All those things will deal with people. So if only for that, you can at least identify some inherent risks. What happens if your product or service doesn't get delivered on time or that doesn't meet expectations? What happens if you're a manufacturing company, let's say, and for some reason your plant can't operate for a host of other reasons? Let's say some employee decides to go on Glassdoor and write a negative review accusing an entity of a hostile work environment or false wage and hours, sexual harassment, or something like that. So I think that there are basic scenarios that every organization can look inward in. as they should anyway, as part of a disaster recovery plan, and then put together a comprehensive crisis communications plan to know what you would say, at least in general, who would say it, how you're going to field those inquiries, how you're going to make sure that people are updated. And there's a whole litany of things that you can do. And if you plan for that, it makes executing on that so much more effective and so much more impactful. Because I tell companies and nonprofits and entities, if somebody is taking a pot shot at you and it starts to go viral and it starts to get the ear of influencers and news organizations, you don't have all day to think about what your response is going to be. You likely have about an hour before that posting, that article starts to then carry some traction without your response, without your narrative, and starts to gain traction to the point that then Google starts to index that because it's so popular with your keywords of your organization that it becomes one of the prominent things, if not the most prominent thing on the first page of a search result. And that's where I get concerned for entities today. I'm less concerned, though it still is something you want to keep an eye on what airs over the broadcast on the 6 o'clock news on the local, let's say, network affiliate news program. That doesn't concern me as much as the long tail effect of that article that now goes on their site, gets shared on social media by a whole slew of people who then comment about what they see because you didn't respond. And so I work on that a lot. More to the point, getting back to what I was emphasizing in the beginning about internal communications, you need to plan on how you're going to talk to your staff about what's going on. And now there certainly will be guidelines if there are privacy concerns and regulatory matters that you have to take into account. But if you don't arm your team with what is going on and what you're doing about it, they're going to be caught flat-footed when the customers call in, when other entities, or they're just going home talking to friends and family. Employees are your best resource to help you get your story told, but you got to let them know what's going on, and they have to feel like they're part of the solution. And I see too many times entities, organizations, companies, nonprofits, you speak to them last. They'd rather put out a press release first to that 6 o'clock news, which is not having the viewership that it had 20 years ago, at the expense of not talking to their team. And I don't care what organization, I don't care what industry, I don't care what size, your team members are your first priority in a crisis communication. Doesn't mean you want to delay the rest of it, but you definitely want to make sure that they are informed and they are empowered to help you get through this. Otherwise, whatever you do in the public eye will not be as effective and might actually be undermined in the process.
That is such an important thing to remember for any organization. And it makes me think about years ago, my family lived in Virginia. When I got out of the Marine Corps, I was stationed at Quantico. So we stayed up in that Northern Virginia area for several years. And I ended up working for a large school system in the area. And I remember when I went to graduate school, I was trying to figure out what area of communication I wanted to focus on for my thesis. And this is right when the DC sniper situation happened.
Yeah,
I don't know if you remember that.
I remember that
well. And I remember I was putting my daughter to bed one night. She was really young. She was still a toddler. And she asked me, why is this bad man doing this? And I found myself at a loss for words. And the reason what you just said is bringing this core memory, right, up to the front,
right,
is I remember thinking about the school systems and how they were having such a difficult time internally. You had teachers who were stressed out about their own children or their families and the situations that we all found ourselves in. They were stressed out about the students and how they were going to best protect their students. There were just so many things. And so that's what I ended up focusing my thesis on, was internal communication within the school system. What type of advice have you worked with school systems? Because, in this day and age of everything that bad that happens, we are hyper focused on schools now. And have you had an opportunity to work with specific school systems on different things?
Yeah, great question. On a certain level, I have, and I usually try to get to the point where if it's, let's say, I get hired at the district level, right? So the superintendent's office and the corporate communications head for a matter. I want to get to a point where we can distribute the messaging and also empower the principals and the teachers for conversations that, as you pointed out, they're going to have with parents because they're on the front lines, right? You can put out a posting on the district website. You can put it out on their Twitter feed and Facebook, and that's all well and good. But the parents deal with the teacher in the classroom who spends every day with the student, or if it's, middle school and high school, a series of teachers, right? But there's 7 or 8. And by the way, they have no real understanding of the district other than maybe they know the superintendent's name, because for them, their quality of education is in that classroom where their child is being educated. And so when we put out a district-wide messaging, and if there are matters that are dealing with one or more particular schools, we've got to get into that campus, and we've got to be able to make sure that the principal and the teachers and the staff are armed accordingly with the right messaging and what to say, because they're the ones who are going to get the questions, not the district. The district may get something from, a reporter, and that's all very important to counter. But I get as concerned about what is it that we're going to arm those individuals who deal with the parents on a day-to-day basis. What are they going to be able to say? How are they going to be able to allay any concerns and answer the questions that'll allow them to continue operations? And I think the DC sniper example is a good one. I remember I spent my teenage years in the DC area in Maryland, in my undergraduate degree, and my ROTC unit was George Washington University. So so it rang very very true to me, to understanding how so many different elements of operations within the district and the surrounding communities in Virginia and Maryland were really affected by that. I mean, even the subway system was impacted on their schedule and how people were getting in and out of work if they were coming to work. And this is long before the work from home thing was a standard. I remember how that was so debilitating for so many folks, but you got to get to the internal audiences first as organizations, whether you're school district or whether you were a company affected by that, to tell them what you're doing. And if you don't do that, anything to say the public just sounds at least somewhat hollow, because you have told the employees that they didn't matter as much and they're feeling even less connected. And in a crisis where anxiety levels are already elevated, that's not a good position to be in. So I am a huge fan of that, and I would love to read your thesis one day. I know that would actually be quite the intriguing.
Yeah, dude, way back in the day. Yeah. Going way back.
But I think it's. But to your point, I think that it's relevant just from what you talked about there. The pandemic is certainly an example. Those type of examples, and this is where I think you get to the planning part. Even if you don't necessarily have a plan that speaks specifically to the crisis at hand, there are so many lessons learned that you will have just from putting together the processes and the procedures and training the people on responding and spokesperson and answering those gotcha and uncomfortable questions, that when another crisis happens that may be tangential, may not be necessarily exactly the same, but you could draw some of your lessons learned to put that in place. It makes responding to those unknown or unforeseen instances that much more effective and that much more efficient. And time is absolutely of the essence when something goes down, particularly if you had no idea it was coming. And I think the pandemic was a good one. Hindsight's always 20/20, but for all intents and purposes, we did not, as a people, believe that COVID-19 was going to have the impact that it had until it did.
Absolutely not. Yeah. I think we all got surprised by that.
Yep.
So I think in crisis communication from an organizational perspective, it's probably easy to think that the big problems are the ones that we should probably focus on, the huge issues that could potentially happen. But like you said earlier, it could be just something as simple as someone online is unhappy with the product they received in the mail, or someone online is unhappy with the CEO's political stance on a particular topic, and then they go out in the Twitterverse and they start, doing their thing. I have heard people say, though, and I'm really interested in hearing your take on this. I have heard people say, I'm just not even going to respond to that because I'm not going to legitimize anything that this quote crazy person has to say. It's their problem, their issue.
Yeah.
I just don't even think I need to respond to that because it's absolutely ridiculous. How dangerous of a mindset, or what would you say to someone with that type of a mindset?
Yeah, I would say so. It's a great question to sort of set the answer is that's the crisis that most organizations will face. Somebody, because they now have their own broadcasting device, right? They may not be a journalist, but I have, through the power of my phone and my cell coverage, a camera, a speaker, and because of my social media apps, a distribution system. Yep. You have to look at me as being a broadcaster as much as anything else. So I would say a blanket sort of thought and approach to not responding at all to something like that is not really a good idea. And the reason I say that is they will be the ones who can truly disrupt your reputation online. And that is where most reputations are won and most reputations are lost of organizations. For all the advertisement, for all the public persona, for all the television coverage you may get, ultimately, if there is this loud and boisterous opposition to your stated values in Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn, Medium.com, Glassdoor, Yelp, that's the one that everybody will see, because almost everybody, regardless whether you're an online e-commerce entity or your mom and pop store, somebody says, hey, check out this organization, or they see something on there, they go and they Google you. And if all that negative stuff comes up, it'll at the very least delay their buying decision with you, or very likely just cancel their buying decision. They will decide to go elsewhere and go to a competitor. And that's just the reality of it. Now, I get it where people say, look, I'm not dignifying that with a response because it's outrageous. I don't think that's the right litmus test. I think what you need to look at is how influential is the person making the comment? How much traction are they getting in that tweet? How much is their post being shared, liked, comment? What are you seeing in terms of traction? And if the answer is people are starting to really comment about it, then you really do need to answer, because your lack of response will give the misperception that you don't care or that there's something true there. And that narrative becomes fact by default, because you abdicated your responsibility and your right to defend your reputation. Now, how you defend it is a whole nother story, because there's a right way and a wrong way, and it's threading the needle. But to stay on to the question at hand, just blanket saying, no, I'm not going to respond to anything, I'm not going to dignify that, will likely get you into trouble if that commenter is starting to gain momentum on their own, and you're going to have to respond. Now, I do have a client that's in the nonprofit space that does have an opposing viewpoint that is being regularly shared on social media. But as we've determined, those entities are largely talking amongst themselves. They're not getting shared. They're not getting liked. It's disruptive to some degree, but where we decided to counter is to do a far better job in allowing this entity to tell their own story. They need to revamp their internet presence, their website. They need to do a lot more active engagement and conversations on all the prominent social media platforms. They need to rethink their email marketing strategy, and all the other things to do. Because right now, this entity, this opposing entity, while not necessarily having a big influence, is probably getting a little bit more traction than they deserve by default. But instead of engaging them and legitimizing their concerns, we're gonna focus on being a better champion of our own brand and entity. And that's how we've done it. But I would say that's not the case for most of the clients that I help.
So how often should an organization, regardless of how big they are, check online, and how should they do that? Do you just Google yourself once a week, or once a day? What do you recommend?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is absolutely. Here's the thing. There are free tools that you can do for that. I don't care the size of the organization. You can do it for free. Google Alerts, I think, should be a standard for every organization, whether, again, you're the corner, independent coffee shop, or you're the Fortune 1000 company. You should have keywords set up and in quotes for the organization names and key people, key movers and shakers that are prominent, that you then set up through Google to alert you within a couple of hours, if you want, of somebody posting new content online about you. Good or bad, you should not be the last person to know when somebody is talking about you. Now, you can Google yourself, of course, and you should do that. But I personally, I've got Google Alerts set up on my name and my company's name and all of that, because I want to know when somebody's talking about me. And it's just good practice. The other thing you can use are online services that have sort of a freemium-based pricing. So they're free at the bottom. And then if you want some added services, you pay a small subscription fee to monitor the social media elements for that one. And I think that's just as important from that. And to check those at least a couple of times a week, if not more, depending on the size and scale of the organization. I think those are essential. A lot of times I get called in because, as I said, organizations sort of didn't see the fact that that tweet that was from, as ridiculous as the comments might have been, started to gain traction until it was days, weeks, sometimes months afterwards.
Wow.
And it was only because they started seeing that their repeat customers weren't coming back to the levels that they used to. They're having a longer sales cycle. People are starting to call going, what's this I'm seeing on when I do a search? I don't understand. And it's only after the fact. And now you can still respond to that. You can still get through that in a crisis communications plan. But there are so many other things you're going to have to do for that one. It could take months and could cost you tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix, depending on the size and scale, if you're so late to the game that you don't see it until you have to really do a full-fledged reset.
Right. So who all should be involved when you talk to these organizations, and let's say they're starting from scratch with a communication plan or a crisis communication plan specifically? Do you recommend that they involve a variety of different stakeholders to be a part of that conversation? Who should be involved?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think first off, we've been talking for obvious reasons about involving your employees and your HR department. I think that's essential, but I also believe you should talk to the people who are talking directly to your paying customers, and also the ones who are having connections and building relationships with your business partners, those who help you build your product or services or distribute your products or services. And the other thing that I would certainly do is, if you have investors, donors, if you're a nonprofit or things of that nature, you want to start looking at how you will engage them. In addition to that, you want to look at the general public, the people who may not necessarily have a direct connection, but will take matters of your, of your doing, or ones that you're accused of, personally, and will find it of interest to comment on those. I think all of those need to be in effect. And I think, to the specific point, I think the C-suite needs to be involved. If the C-level is not understanding how they are supposed to be involved, and also how their teams are supposed to be involved, it looks more administrative. This process can get sort of more of a paperwork drill. And, you put a check in the box and everybody sort of files it away, and no one makes it a priority until the crisis happens. And then, although you put together these great plans, the C-suite doesn't know what to do, and it becomes a bit chaotic and less effective, and just costs you more in the long run. This is really a question about how much money are you willing to spend to restore your reputation. And as we all say, an ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. I see a lot of times where organizations wait until the house is literally, if not, or figuratively, if not literally on fire. But, it's because they didn't think that it was as big of an issue, or that, everybody knows what it's supposed to do. This is not an inherent skill in responding in a crisis when anxiety levels
Right.
are high. You need to train for it. You need to involve multiple stakeholders at the highest level, at least to understand what to do. It's that important.
Do you recommend mock crisis scenarios?
Absolutely. I will, on occasion, I get asked to be brought in by organizations to help them prepare scenarios where no crisis is occurring. And I love that because we sort of look at what are the most common risk factors that you have? What are the things that may get you into trouble? We develop crisis scenarios, and then I throw the C-suite, the CEO, the chief marketing officer, the COO, the VP of sales, and their direct reports, their director level people, if it's a big enough organization, into scenarios where somebody is asking them really uncomfortable questions. And I do that in a manner where we set up scenarios where it's a traditional reporter, but I also do phone interviews with pretending to be customers or clients or big investors or donors, asking different questions. And the questions I ask are ones that contain an inherent bias. In other words, the questions assume that somebody did something wrong. Because what I want to train the spokesperson, whether that's the CEO or somebody else, depending on the audience, to be able to respond to is in a way that expresses empathy and action. And by empathy, I don't mean culpability, but to tell that audience member that you hear them and stay on message and be able to be effective in calming the fears and being able to give a little bit of space to get back to normal operation. Because when somebody is accusing you, at least in some sort of passive aggressive, underlying way, most people who really love what they do will take that personally. And so they'll respond in an, somewhat caustic or angry or upset tone. And that only raises the bar. And yet you don't want to sound so distant that you don't care. And it's not, like I said, it's not a skill that comes inherently. You have to really train to that. And I train to it as the best, as realistic of scenarios as I can to a wide range of people who are going to respond, because I try to make them tougher than the actual event, because that way, God forbid they have to, they'll be ready for it.
Have you had anyone ask you, what are your thoughts on political discussions within the workplace? Because we know that's a huge thing right now. I mean, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, whatever your politics are, your ideology.
Yeah.
If you start, so many companies are becoming more involved in politics. So what are your thoughts about that?
I've done a couple of video blogs on this, and my answer to that in general is, look, if you're an organization that takes a stance on an issue, whether it's politics or whether it's something that you think is sort of broader range on that, whether it's environment or women's rights or things of that nature, I think that's fine. I think you shouldn't be afraid to do so if you have a culture and a value system that allows you to do that. What I would suggest, though, is that you remain authentic in that, and you have to show empathy and action in all of your communications. Just to say, and I'll give you an example. When the George Floyd murder trial took place, when the police officer was convicted, there were plenty of organizations that I saw that put out statements talking about the rights of George Floyd and working toward that. And they were what I would call, they were very broad brush, very benign statements. But a lot of them, and I had a couple call me, a lot of them would say, well, we feel like we have to say something. And my answer was, well, why? And what I was trying to get at is, unless you're telling me that this is a consistent policy and practice of you to say something, I don't think saying anything sort of helps you. In fact, it makes it look like you're just sort of stating words for words' sake. More to the point, if all you do is state words without having action to that, without showing what it is you're doing in the support of the cause, now you look like you're just being disingenuous. And I think it has the opposite effect. So on that level, I think you should, as long as you're consistent in the messaging and you're willing to be respectful of others, I think that's fine. I think Patagonia, just as an aside, as an example, is a prime example of that. They focus on one particular issue, and that's climate change and sustainability. And everything they do, including their philanthropic, what I'll call their sort of issues-based support, falls in line with that. And they're extraordinarily consistent, and they have extraordinarily solid brand in that one. If you shop at Patagonia, it's not only about the products that they sell, but the values that they espouse. Now, internally, to get to your actually specific question about, do you allow political discussions and issues-based to occur in the workforce? I would say it goes along the same lines. If you are one that engages in that on some level, then I would say as long as you're consistent, that's fine. I would certainly recommend you create a culture of respect and civility when you do that. But I know a lot of organizations that are absolutely pro-left, what we would call certainly left-wing politics, and ones that are very pro-right-wing politics. And everybody who works in there engages in those discussions with that in mind, and they're successful. We may disagree with one perspective or another, and we'll probably vote with our dollars by not supporting that organization. But internally, if it works, that's fine. Where you get into trouble is when you're sort of establishing these policy and practices piecemeal or by happenstance. And that's when the crisis occurs. And that's when everybody sort of then gets into a lather. And that's when you see the post on Glassdoor and Medium.com and Twitter, and the company is in a disarray. And that's when I usually get called in. If you're consistent and you express it with empathy and action, I think that's fine.
So it sounds like it really stems from the core values. Like you really do need to be sure what your company's core values are and how your actions are exemplifying those core values.
A lot of the crises that I deal with that has an internal origin. In other words, somebody said something to somebody, right, and they took exception to that, and it was brought up to a higher, a supervisor or somebody in higher management. And the actions that management took didn't seem to align with the core values. That's when a crisis occurs. Now, there are times, and similarly too, even externally, if there is a belief by a customer, an investor, an entity that the company is not meeting expectations and not following their own core values, that's also when a crisis occurs. There are some times where somebody's just taking a pot shot, and that. Even then, there's a miscommunication because, like I said about this entity I'm working with, they're not doing enough to really talk about their core values and what they're doing. So they leave others to assume things that that we wind up showing are incorrect. But a lot of that has to do with not adhering to the core values and not following that, and a belief that this company isn't what I thought they were, or this entity is no longer the one that I want to associate, and that usually discusses a crisis. Now, I don't mean to certainly take away the moments where there's this big catastrophic event, this huge accident, things like that. Like those are just, those could have different responses. But even then, the after effect of that, how an organization will respond if in those major catastrophes, how they follow their core values, what they do to make things right, even if it wasn't their own doing, will speak volumes about how long the crisis communication event lasts. We see a lot of entities that all of a sudden it's like, hey, this major thing happens. There's a lot of empathy, a lot of support for this organization. And then their follow-through doesn't seem to match what they said they were going to do, or doesn't seem to match what people thought that this organization would do just based on their core values. And then we see like the follow-on stories, right? Weeks or months later, like, here we are 2 weeks later, this organization still hasn't taken care of its people. And now they find themselves in another crisis. I see that a lot.
So do you recommend that everybody in the C-suite, for example, get some type of media coaching as a part of their preparation?
Yes, absolutely. On the C-suite, the director levels, and anybody who talks to somebody, it's just that reality that we have now, where if you are talking to an audience, you probably need to have some sort of media training. Now, I don't, I can see some entities going, okay, wait a minute, I got 500 employees. I can't train all 500, right? I get that. But at least I would say at the C-suite, the director, and maybe even the senior management level, you need to have some media training or some presentation coaching for the gotcha questions, because everybody's going to get hit some way with a text or, ambushed at, in the office environment, or get a phone call from somebody who says, what's going on? And you should understand what it is and what it is you're supposed to say and how you're supposed to say it. That's important.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Don't underestimate the power of that 24-hour customer service line when you have just, you call it and some random person answers it. And I mean, it's happened to me. I know it's happened to plenty of other people where you get on the phone and it's just, it's going downhill from there.
No. Yeah. And by the way, the crisis rarely occurs between 9 and 5.
Right. Yeah.
That's just the reality, right? It never fails. And that's why I talk about not only the C-suite, but the directors and senior managers, because invariably the crisis will happen when the senior executive is on vacation or unavailable because they're on a plane and something like that. We had one in the Navy that we had an accident on board that severely injured 2 sailors, and the commanding officer was on leave. It was a long weekend. We were doing anything. We were just getting ready for some workups. He was on leave, and the executive officer was there. And we didn't miss a beat when that happened from a communications and reaching out to folks, because we knew what to do. That's one thing, that from your Marine Corps days. The one thing that I think the military service does real well is assuming that the next person up is going to have to fill a role for which that they may not necessarily be exactly trained for, because in chaotic times, that's just what happens. Somebody actually gets taken out of commission or just isn't available, and you've got to step up. More organizations and entities need to do that. It's so important.
Oh, absolutely. Next in line. You got to figure out who's next in line.
Totally.
And don't put them in a position of being surprised by that and then wonder, how could this happen if they haven't been properly trained, to handle something like that. What is that one quintessential example that you wish every single organization would look at and be like, look, if there's one example, that this is exactly the example you need to look at, so you can kind of wake up and understand how important being prepared is, and how important it is to just to make sure that everybody understands what their roles and responsibilities are in a crisis.
Yeah, I go back about 4 years. If you remember the United Airlines incident where that passenger was dragged off the plane. Now let's reset. The passenger was told to leave, and by contract that we all have with the ticket, it's not guarantee you a seat if they've oversold it. Nobody, they needed to pull that one there. They said, you got to get off the plane. He refused. And they called law enforcement to come in to ask him to leave. He refused again. And then they had to physically try to remove him, and he resisted that. And so, the picture that everybody saw on the plane is this individual bloodied up, pretty well beat up as he resisted arrest by law enforcement, and now forcibly dragged by his arms off the plane. But the problem was everybody took their phone on that plane and just followed that incident out there. And United Airlines' response was essentially to issue a statement to the press, not showing any empathy in action. And that, at least to the extent that I know it, that's all they did. No one ever talked to anybody internally. No one ever talked to anybody on the business side from that one there, other than some operational, but not from a crisis communications level. And so for days and weeks on end, United's share price plummeted and their market cap tanked. And people were going on Facebook and other social medias with their United Airlines, Visa card, frequent flyer with all their points, and showing videos of them shredding those cards. I'm not flying United ever again. This is how they treat people. Now imagine being that ticket counter agent that, like at O'Hare Airport, let's say, the next morning. How bad was their job? They've not been told anything. They've not seen anything. And now you got passengers coming up, checking in for the next flight going, you going to throw me off this plane too? And just deluged with that. and they have
Mm-hmm.
no idea what to say on that one. If you
Mm-hmm.
want to see like, here's what not to do, that's a perfect example of that. I'll give you an example though of what to do. A good example. So
Mm-hmm.
if you remember the Dallas Mavericks, the NBA basketball team owned by
Mm-hmm.
billionaire Mark Cuban, he had an incident where internally it was discovered that the CEO he had running the company had a pattern of sexual harassment and sexual and hostile work environment. And it got to the point where it was he brought in an outside investigator. It was all proven to be true. The CEO's fired. Mark Cuban went around to the front office of the Dallas Mavericks personally and apologized to all of the employees, including the women, for not having his eye on the ball. He said, "This is on me. I did not have as much governance on this one there." And he said something to the effect of, "I know that I can't take back, I can't recover the trauma that you all have, but I can promise you that I will not let that happen again moving forward." He then gave a significant amount of money. I want to say like $10 million to women's causes. And he then went on a CEO search and hired a CEO from AT&T with lauded business experience, who, oh, by the way, happened to be an African-American woman.
Mm-hmm.
And she came in quickly and said, "Here's the new value system. Here's the new way we're going to operate that." And Mark Cuban then and this new CEO went on the interview circuit, and he opened door. He goes, "I'm not running away from my mistakes. This is on me. Ask me any question you want." He didn't do that once. He did that multiple times in local Dallas news as well as national news, and did that from there. That if you want to look at how to do that right, see, starting with the employees, Mark Cuban did it right with that incident.
That's amazing because I don't know. Why do you think there are so many examples within leadership who, I don't know if the right word is afraid, to take that level of responsibility publicly? Do you think maybe there's this idea that they will be held accountable in some way? Maybe they'll get fired or sued, or what are the myths out there?
It's a great question. I think there's two reasons. I'll go with the smaller one first and then the bigger one. The smaller one is, I think there's always the concern about the legal liability. The more you talk about it, the more transparent you are, the more attorneys will tell you, look, you're exposing yourself to greater liability. And I get that. The problem is you may be trying to protect the legal liability of an entity so much so that you lose all your business. Then what are you protecting? If the business is not going to be able to retain its clients, its customers, its business partners, you don't have a business anymore. So there's certainly that balance to strike. The second thing, though, that I would say is the big reason why you see a lot of leaders not be forthright and candid for that is because doing so takes them out of their comfort zone. Like, people are successful on some level to get to a C-suite, right? Or a senior VP level of a large entity. And they do so. And I know I'm not trying to be a sociologist. I'm certainly not trying to be a psychologist. But in my experience, it's because they largely possess two characteristics in general, for any leader of any entity. First off is they've ignored the naysayers. They have said, tuned them out, and they've said to themselves, I can achieve this, kept their eye on the prize, and they've moved forward. So they've tuned out everybody who told them that they couldn't do it. And the second thing they've done really well is they have been able to battle through, around, over any obstacle that was purposely put in their way in order to get to the prize. Well, that is a flight or fight mentality that in a crisis communications entity is their natural state, but it really doesn't serve them well, because what it means is that when somebody's chirping about them, they're like, I'm not commenting, I'm going to keep my eye on the prize, I'm going to move forward, allowing that narrative to then fester online and become fact by default, if not by design. And the second thing is, if they do respond, they respond with this argumentative point, counterpoint. You don't know what you're talking about. You're an idiot. What do you have to say? And that type of response and that approach only increases the level of animosity and anxiety. It's like what we see on cable news when you get two people just shouting at each other.
Right.
It makes for funny theater and popcorn, popcorn movies, but sucks for for businesses and nonprofits, you have to show empathy in action, and it's just out of their comfort zone. They haven't been trained to it, and at least most leaders are, and that's why I think you see the responses often that you see from entities when stuff goes down.
So those wonderful characteristics that you display that make you so incredibly tough and able to work your way up, maybe hold off a little bit when you get to that. You're at the top now. We need to start listening to others.
a lot of the time I spend with organizations is trying to take them out of their comfort zone to respond. And I say, look, this is the reason I do that is because we want to get back to normal operations as quickly as we can, want to preserve the reputation to the extent we can, if not completely repair it, but then get you to a state where you can, right? The crisis situation, diffuse the anxiety, give you a little bit of space to fix whatever you need to fix, even if it's just simply miscommunication or a lack of effective communication on your end. You may be doing everything right. People just don't understand it. And you got to be better at that. And look, if you've done something wrong, I've represented organizations and individuals who did something wrong. And if you own it and you are forthright about it, empathetic to how people respond, apology, and then get to an action plan to fix that, you can turn this around quickly. I had one instances with an organization made a flippant reference to COVID-19 as the China virus. And I would just tell you that he truly wasn't trying to be disrespectful to the Asian population, but it was a situation where, given everybody's background that was in the room, that's something that everybody was saying right away. A reporter caught wind of that. It went viral. And to this CEO's credit, he goes, I was a slip of the tongue. I screwed up. I'm sorry. I apologize to everybody that was offended in the room, and I'm apologizing now. I need to choose my words carefully. That won't happen again. And I'm sorry for anybody that I offended. And the story lasted a day, and that was it.
Yeah.
Game over. And because he owned it. It's like, I screwed up. My bad. I won't do that again. And people really respect that. It's, everybody screws up. It's how you respond to that can make or break a reputation of an individual or organization.
From a media standpoint, from the news media standpoint, what level of responsibility, or what would you say to news, to news organizations about the part that they play in either adding to the worsening of a situation or adding to, an organization's ability to recover from, because there is a lot of power, right, in the news ecosystem and in the way they cover certain stories. Have you ever had those types of conversations with people within the media as to what level of responsibility do they have to all of this?
I have had conversations related to, I've got one right now with a entity here in Southern California with a reporter that's doing a feature story, and he's taken exception. The reporter's taken exception to some established business practices, but they're all legal. And we've had some actually very constructive dialogue with the reporter on the fairness of the article. And here's where I think, here's the conversations I've had with them. You want to write the story? That's really none of my business. If you think that there's an audience for that story and you think that there's a question that should be raised, I really don't have a say whether you should write that story or not. And there are others who would disagree with me, going, this is much to do about nothing. Why is he writing about it? Why is she writing about it? That's really not of our concern. And oh, by the way, there's a lot of pressure within media organizations right now to write some things that you may not consider to be newsworthy, but they will capture the eyeballs of people who are now got so many thousands of opportunities and options at their disposal, not only just through cable, right, but all of the internet streaming services and just YouTube itself is just killing their entities. So if you think you need to do it, that's fine. All I ask for is that we get an equal say in the narrative, and what you report about what we've said is accurate and fair and verifiable. So that's where I think media has a role. Now, the question really is, where is media's role related to what it was 20, 25 years ago? And I have a lot of friends that are journalists that do amazing work to make sure that they are covering things that matter and allowing people to know what is going on and why they should care. And I respect the profession. It has never been more besieged than it is now, given the fact that the Kardashians, let's say, are as much, if not more, of an influencers on information than somebody who has been a trained journalist at the national level for 30 years. And so that's why I think you see a lot of the cable news in particular and other internet streamings. They're more entertainment than they are news.
Yeah.
And I don't wish that on anybody. And here's the thing that I would tell entities and organizations. You're really not in control of that. But what you are in control is the same thing that is putting so much pressure on news organizations to be entertainers on social media and video and gotcha. Right. You have the same opportunity, though, to promote your narrative, to promote your states, because the same things, the same tools that people have to take a pot shot at you are available to you to espouse what you stand for and what you do. And I see a lot of organizations not taking full advantage of that, particularly on the small to mid-size. And I would say it's no longer something that you can say, well, it's not that important. I don't get a lot of business from that. The reputation will be won and lost online, and you need to invest in that because it's so important.
This has been such an interesting conversation. I can't believe we've been talking for almost an hour already.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like completely flown by, but everything that we have been discussing is so incredibly important from so many different standpoints. Is there a question or is there a point that you wanted to make sure that you were able to emphasize before we end the interview?
Yeah, I appreciate the time. And by the way, this has been a blast, Jen. I appreciate doing this. Thanks for having me on.
It's been a lot of fun. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, this has been so much fun. But I'll just reemphasize two things we talked about already. First off, your employees are your primary audience. That is your top concern. You don't want to necessarily delay talking to all of your other audiences, but don't forget your employees and make them priority one, because that will make sure that your crisis communications efforts are more effective, or if you don't take them into account, less effective. That's a guarantee on that. The second, as I would talk about, we mentioned it in passing, don't be the last to know that somebody's talking about you online. Reputations are won and lost online. You need to know when somebody's talking about you, and you need to take that into account, and you need to have a solid presence for that. It's the only way it's going to work. This has been a blast. Thanks for having me on, Jen.
No, thank you. And we will have another conversation at some point. I think in 2023, we'll have to talk about getting you back on, because I know because this is such a fascinating topic and there's so many different directions that we can go, that need to be covered, need to be discussed. So I hope that you'll be back and we'll go down those roads as well. How can organizations contact you if they need you? And hopefully they're not going to contact you after it's already hit the fan. Yeah. How do they contact you now before that happens?
I tell people I'm like a bail bondsman. Hopefully you never have to call me for anything bad, but have it on speed dial, because have me on speed dial and in the middle of the night, because that's just how it works. I have my website, publicrelationssecurity.com, publicrelationssecurity.com. But if you Google Dave Oates, Crisis PR, my LinkedIn profile, my Facebook, all of my social media accounts pop up, my YouTube channel, by all means, please connect. I'd love to talk. And I've got an opportunity on the website, you can schedule a 15-minute conversation. If you've got something percolating, you're just not sure about it, I'll give you 15 minutes of my time. I love what I do. And if I can just be a sounding board for that and nothing more, by all means, I'm happy to certainly allow that to be put on my schedule and take it from there. It's truly, I love what I do.
I can tell. And that's the great thing about being in the communication field. I think those of us who have been doing this for a while, we just love making those connections and being of service, continuing, to be of service.
Totally.
Thank you again. I'll make sure that your contact information, the website, all of that, the URL is going to be in the show notes. That way it'll just be a quick and easy click on the link. And that way, anybody who is interested, they can contact you directly, ask their questions. Like we said, emphasize, get on it early. Do not wait until it hits the fan. Thank you again so much, Dave. I really appreciate it.
It's really a pleasure, Jen. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review.